The long-awaited remake of Final Fantasy VII is here at last, or at least the first part is. If any game in the series deserved a remake, it was absolutely Final Fantasy VII. It's not just that it is the most beloved game in the series, or that it has the most famous heroes and villains of any JRPG, or even that it had the biggest cultural impact of any Final Fantasy game and defined a generation of gamers. It is all of that, plus a little something called timing. The game was due for a remake simply because it was made during the greatest transition video gaming has ever seen, the monumental leap from 2D graphics on 16-bit hardware to 3D graphics on 32-bit hardware. Considering what a massive success the remake of Final Fantasy VII has been for Square Enix so far, we have to ask ourselves the obvious question. Should we expect to see similar remakes for other games in the series? And if so, which one's the next in line? The truth is that no one knows what Square's development roadmap looks like, or at least no one who's gonna talk about it. And let's be honest, whatever their roadmap looks like in 2020, it's likely to change a lot before the last chapter of Final Fantasy VII Remake hits the stores. What we can do is put on our Sherlock Holmes hats and engage in some honest-to-God deduction, because who doesn't like solving mysteries? So let's take a deep dive into the Final Fantasy series to answer the question, which Final Fantasy game will be remade next? Let's lay down some ground rules. First of all, I'll only be taking into consideration the mainline Final Fantasy games. No sequels, side stories, or spin-offs. Just the numbered games in the main series. I'm also excluding Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV from the list, not because they don't deserve the love, but because as MMOs, they're another beast entirely and don't really slide naturally into this conversation. That leaves us with a total of 12 numbered Final Fantasy games, from Final Fantasy I through Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VIII through Final Fantasy X, and at the tail end, Final Fantasy XII, XIII, and XV. Now, what I'm talking about here isn't a remaster or graphics update, but a total remake in the style of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Something that looks and feels like a modern AAA title. I'll expand more on this later, as it will influence some of my decisions. The first game to be eliminated from consideration should come as no surprise. Final Fantasy I is a classic, and it deserves a lot of love, considering it made Hironobu Sakaguchi's career, and without it, there wouldn't be a Square Enix today. But if we're being honest, the first title in the series doesn't have a whole lot in common with the games that went on to build the legend of Final Fantasy. Sure, a lot of the basic DNA is there. It's a turn-based JRPG with a world map, towns, dungeons, and random encounters. There's crystals, black mages, and an airship. But the game has a paper-thin plot, a total lack of memorable characters or locations, and it doesn't even have a proper protagonist. For a series of games famous for their intricate plots and amazing characters, Final Fantasy I feels more like a prototype than a solid entry. Remaking the game would require spinning out characters and scenarios from scratch, a gargantuan undertaking that would result in a product almost unrecognizable from the original. At that point, you might as well just make a whole new game. Imagine for a second that this video was titled, "Which is the last Final Fantasy that would ever get a remake?" If it were, this next game would be my pick. Final Fantasy II for the NES is something of a black sheep in the series. The story of the Final Fantasy series is a story of innovation, and this bold attitude was front and center in the first sequel. Not content to retread the concepts from the first game, the sequel instead made sweeping changes. The D&D inspired leveling system was ripped right out and replaced with a skill-based growth system reminiscent of the Elder Scrolls games, where characters got better at what they did, whether it be swinging a sword, casting black magic, or getting hit in the face. The game also improved on the predecessor's formula, providing a more interesting world, a more complex plot, and characters that actually had some personality. Credit where credit is due. Final Fantasy II was a worthy sequel and an ambitious game for its time, but history hasn't been kind to it. Never released outside of Japan in its prime, few people in the West have played this game, and only a stalwart few would rank it as one of their favorites. The skill-based growth system was confusing and no one really liked it. The story was better, but still far short of the later games in the series, and honestly, the game just isn't that fun. There's little love out there for Final Fantasy II, and the game doesn't often get recommended to newbies. Announcing a remake would have people scratching their heads in confusion, and that's really not the response you want. Final Fantasy III is a big step up from its predecessors. This is where the series really came into its own, and where many of the iconic concepts we associate with Final Fantasy today, like summons and jobs the heroes can switch freely between, made their first appearance. This game is, in my opinion, the first true Final Fantasy, and it still holds up today. If the previous two games feel like prototypes, then this is the proof of concept. It's a much more enjoyable game to play. Combat is faster and smoother, there's a lot more dialogue, and the scenarios are fun and inventive. The soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu also improved by leaps and bounds, showing a glimmer of the sheer magic he would go on to deliver for the SNES entries in the series. Final Fantasy III feels like a dyed-in-the-wool Final Fantasy game, but it still lacks that final ingredient that turned the best games in the series into masterpieces: the story. The game's four heroes might as well be interchangeable, and the scenarios that play out have a random feel to them, lacking a common thread that would tie them together. A remake needs a core of amazing characters and a memorable story, and there's just not enough substance here to justify the effort. Now that we've banished the traditional NES trilogy that laid the foundation for the Final Fantasy franchise, let's take a look at the series' more recent history. It should go without saying that announcing a remake of the latest entry in the series would be an absurd move. The whole point of a remake is to cash in on the awesome power of the enduring love that your fans have for a game that's regarded as a classic masterpiece by updating the game for modern audiences. Some of the greatest gaming experiences of all time are now locked away behind steel doors of ever-building expectations. Classic video games are products of their time, and the technological limits of past hardware is a barrier to entry for younger gamers. It simply isn't possible to start up the original Final Fantasy VII and get the same experience a kid in 1997 had. Creators of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s worked wonders with the resources available to them. But now that we've seen the depths of storytelling made possible by modern 3D graphics, motion capture animation, fully orchestrated soundtracks, and professional voice acting, there's no going back. A remake is a chance for the creators to tell the story the way they always wanted, unhampered by the limitations of the past. So the further along the path to modern gaming we get, the less the point of a remake. If the technology was already in place when the game first came out, then why bother? It's been only 4 years since Final Fantasy XV came out, and the world and character models are pretty much on par with Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game is just as playable today as it was in 2016, and it will be for years and years. For the same reason, I'm also disqualifying Final Fantasy XIII. Lightning's trilogy for the PS3 still looks gorgeous. The voice acting is top rate, and wherever you stand on the issue of the game's merits, its battle system is as smooth as silk compared to some of the older titles. The improvements made by a potential remake would be marginal at best. But where do we draw the line? What about the games on the PlayStation 2? Final Fantasy XII is one of the most innovative entries in the series. This game, the first in the series without original creator Hironobu Sakaguchi at the helm, took a lot of risks and made sweeping changes to the gameplay, doing away with random encounters and introducing a combat system and exploration scheme that blended elements of MMOs into the familiar mix. At the time, many fans found the changes jarring, and the final outcome, although interesting, was divisive in ways no previous game in the series had been. In addition, Final Fantasy XII's story was plagued by several unfortunate storytelling blunders, and despite a cast of great supporting characters, the game has one of the series' weakest protagonists in Vaughn. Final Fantasy XII is kind of a double whammy. Not only is the game relatively unpopular with fans, but in an ironic twist, the game's greatest merits also work against it when discussing a possible remake. That is, the game has aged very well. The gameplay holds up, the graphics are still good, especially in the remastered version, and the dialogue and voice acting is a masterpiece. I would love to see a remake of Final Fantasy XII if, and only if, they committed to rewriting the game's story to fix some of its most glaring flaws. As it is, there's really no point in trying to polish something that already shines. When Square made the leap from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2, they really stuck the landing. Final Fantasy X was a great achievement. The graphics were impressive and the pre-rendered cutscenes were so spectacular we couldn't believe our eyes. The game had a great cast of charming, lovable characters, an engaging story, and in my opinion, the best turn-based combat system in the series. It's so smooth and enjoyable, it's just perfection. Final Fantasy X was also the first game in the series to feature voice acting, and while the results were a bit of a mixed bag, it was a huge deal at the time and really added a lot to the experience. Countless fans got their first taste of Final Fantasy with this game, and Final Fantasy X remains one of the most popular in the series. This one's borderline to me. I think it's safe to say that announcing a remake would make a lot of people very happy, and while I think it would be cool to see Final Fantasy X remade, I think it would be a waste to devote resources on remaking something that still holds up so well today. For that reason alone, Final Fantasy X falls just short of making my shortlist. Let's recap what we've done so far. We've eliminated 7 games, leaving us with a shortlist of 5 Final Fantasy titles that occupy a certain sweet spot. The point at which Square had started to make fantastic games with wonderful characters and amazing stories that people fell in love with, but before they had the hardware to tell those stories using the full range of storytelling techniques available to modern game makers. Those games are Final Fantasy IV, 5, 6, 8, and 9. And obviously Final Fantasy VII would have been on this list had it not been for, Final Fantasy V is a wonderful game that doesn't get nearly enough credit. It was a big step up from its predecessor in terms of graphics, music, and sound design. The world was the largest and most interesting to date, and the game conveyed a truly magical sense of adventure. The story, for all its simplicity, had a strong hook and a bunch of neat twists and turns. Final Fantasy V is also really fun to play. The job system, first introduced in Final Fantasy I and then iterated upon in Final Fantasy III, really came into its own with this game. Leveling up jobs and mixing and matching their abilities is just so much fun, and the game has so many secrets and so much optional content it keeps you coming back for more. That said, while Final Fantasy V holds a special place in my heart, I can't say it would make the best candidate for a remake. When it comes to gameplay and exploration, Final Fantasy V shines, but in other areas it took a bit of a backward stumble. The story's kinda cheesy, the characters aren't as memorable or iconic as Cecil and Kain from Final Fantasy IV, and the game didn't see an overseas release back in the day. For these reasons, Final Fantasy V is one of the least popular entries in the series. As much as I'd love to see a remake, I don't think a lot of people would be as enthusiastic about it. Earlier I said that Final Fantasy III is the first truly recognizable Final Fantasy game. Well, if so, its sequel, Final Fantasy IV, is the birth of the fully fledged Final Fantasy. This was a landmark title. The first SNES entry in the series finally had all the elements you'd expect from a modern Final Fantasy game. With the introduction of the active time battle system, battles ran smoother and were more enjoyable. The game's story was breathtaking for its time. Despite the disastrous English localization, the plot was focused and immersive, using cutscenes and interesting scenarios to tell the tale and offering up some surprises along the way. The large cast of characters all had their own distinctive personalities and came with stories of their own and room for growth. Here, the Final Fantasy series also got its first true protagonist in Cecil, whose story of redemption and personal growth on his journey from a dark knight in the service of an evil regime to a paladin fighting for justice has gone down as one of the most iconic stories in JRPG history. To top it all off, Nobuo Uematsu turned out a soundtrack to match, writing the 16-bit hardware to deliver one of the early masterworks of video game music. I gotta tell ya, we've come to the point where it's starting to get a little bit harder to come up with reasons to disqualify games. Final Fantasy IV is a fantastic game that truly deserves to see a remake. But the point of this video isn't to identify which of the games deserve a remake, because they pretty much all do, but rather to pick one game that most deserves it. So let's soldier on. The main strike against Final Fantasy IV is that, honestly, time has passed it by. The game was a big deal when it first came out, and it used to be very dear to a lot of people. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was still a healthy debate going on about which Final Fantasy was the best ever made, between 6, 7, and 4. Yeah, many people used to argue that this game, Final Fantasy IV, was the best in the series. Those days are long gone. As time passed, Final Fantasy IV has faded into relative obscurity, and there just aren't a whole lot of fans left who still dream of seeing Cecil and Kain embark on a new journey in high definition. As cool as I think a remake would be, I don't think it would stir up enough interest to bring the customers to market, unfortunately. I feel like someone's gonna put me in front of a firing squad for saying this, but Final Fantasy IX is actually not one of my favorite games in this series. In fact, on most days, it wouldn't even crack my top 5. Every hardcore fan has that point when, in their eyes at least, the franchise peaked, and everything that comes after just can't quite live up to their lofty expectations. Call it peak hype if you will. For me, that point came somewhere between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX. This is where I started nitpicking, and as great a game as Final Fantasy IX is, if you look closely enough, there's plenty of nits to pick. Battles are slow as molasses, the game's version of active time battle is fundamentally broken, some of the playable characters feel like an afterthought compared to the core group, and the way you learn abilities from equipment starts out fun, but loses more and more of its charm the further you get into the game. Still, there's a lot of people who love this game, and it's easy to see why. The intro sequence centering on the Tantalus Company's daring scheme to kidnap the princess from right under the queen's nose is probably the best and most exciting in the series to date, and the resulting dynamic between the core group of Zidane, Garnet, Vivi, and Steiner is so much fun to watch. These are characters to love, whose personalities shine through in every line of dialogue. The writing in this game is superb, next level stuff compared to the previous games. Final Fantasy IX is a captivating story set in a vibrant fairy tale world, and the graphics were made to match. The game's visual style is probably its greatest asset. By opting for a style that was colorful and exaggerated over the realistic designs of the two previous games for the PlayStation 1, Square were able to push the hardware to its limits. Final Fantasy IX looks like a gorgeous cartoon. It's aged so much better than its predecessors. As great as Final Fantasy IX is, it falls just short of making my final 2. The reason I'm striking it as a candidate is a stylistic one. Simply put, if the point is to find the best candidate to be made into a game in the same style as Final Fantasy VII Remake, then Final Fantasy IX isn't a great fit. Hyper-detailed, realistic graphics would just rip the soul out of Zidane's story. If this game were to be remade, I'd want to see something more along the lines of Dragon Quest XI. Which, to be fair, would be pretty sweet. To me, it comes down to two last candidates, Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VIII. This is a tough choice for me, and even as I'm writing this part of the script, I still don't know for sure which one I'd pick. So let's just think it through, shall we? One game at a time. Before I wrap this up, I just want to say YouTube is incredibly competitive, and as a tiny channel, I am so happy you found your way to this video. If you could take the time to give me a thumbs up or write a quick comment, you'd be doing me a huge favor. Let's start with Final Fantasy VI. Square's final effort for the SNES was a giant leap forward in terms of storytelling and character complexity. Gameplay, graphics, and music were all integrated into a cohesive whole, something that was deliberately designed to deliver an unforgettable experience and convey strong feelings of despair and hope. It was the first full-grown masterpiece of the genre. It made Square the undisputed gods of the JRPG and composer Nobuo Uematsu a legend. It might seem silly given how primitive the game looks today, but to gamers in the mid-90s, this was a magical experience. Back then, games weren't supposed to draw you into the story like this, and they certainly weren't supposed to make you care. Cyan saying goodbye to his departed wife and son, Edgar's coin toss that set his brother free, the introductory march through the snowfield set to the dramatic orchestral arrangement of Terra's theme. These are memories that will stay with me forever. It's almost impossible to overstate the impact this game had on RPG fans. Sure, Final Fantasy VII was the game that brought the JRPG into the mainstream, but Square had a large following of loyal fans even before, and with only a few years separating these two games, aficionados of Final Fantasy VII could easily backtrack and experience the previous games in the series at a time when they still held up extremely well. Today, Final Fantasy VI feels old. A lot has happened in 26 years, but Terra's story of self-discovery and growth and the epic struggle against the megalomaniacal Kefka still deserves to be told. A makeover in the same style as Final Fantasy VII Remake would grant this masterpiece new life and make it accessible to a new generation of gamers. But ironically, in the context of a modern remake, the game's most defining feature could be a fatal flaw. I'm talking, of course, about the characters. Final Fantasy VI has an ensemble cast, the largest out of all the games in the series. And while many fans have tender feelings for Terra, Locke, Celes, Edgar, Sabin, Cyan, and others, the large cast does mean that love is spread across a lot of characters. It's also the only modern Final Fantasy game that doesn't have a clear-cut protagonist. Terra is probably the hero, but you could easily make a case for Celes or maybe Locke or maybe even Edgar. The large cast is not a problem in the original game, but if we're talking about an update to the same level of detail seen in Final Fantasy VII Remake, that's a lot of characters to model, supply with dialogue, and hire top-notch voice talent for. So, we've come to the final game on the list, and yes, Final Fantasy VIII is one of my final two candidates. Just hear me out, okay? For a game released in the middle of Square's golden age, Final Fantasy VIII gets a lot of flack. The game's hero, Squall, is kinda boring. The story is ridiculous. The world makes no sense, and the magic system is a big mistake. Still, this game is my favorite in the series. Hot on the heels of the triumph that was Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII is Square's defining rockstar moment. The point at which they realized they could pretty much go on stage and do whatever they wanted. This game oozes edgy 90s style from its pores, personified in Squall and Cypher, two rival military cadets whose weapons are literally both a sword and a gun, and who wouldn't be seen outside their dorm rooms wearing anything but leather and fur, a gallon of hair gel, and enough belts to strangle a bear. The story is a crazy ride that takes the heroes across time and quite literally space. The scenarios are epic and outrageous, kicked off by the most dramatic FMV intro so far. Final Fantasy VIII might be the most cinematic experience in the franchise to date, and its world is the one that most closely resembles our own, with cars, buses, trains, and... I guess we don't have any flying buildings where kids train to be magic-wielding mercenaries, do we? Close enough. Sure, Squall isn't winning any personality contests. He can be kind of a dick, and he makes Cloud Strife look like a regular chatterbox in comparison. But he's a subtle character with a lot of depth, and his brand of awkward cool and quiet introspection really connected with me in my late teens. Throughout the story, he grows a lot, bonds with his classmates, and falls in love. That last part was a big draw for me. The romance between Squall and Rinoa is, to my mind, easily the most meaningful and satisfying in all of Final Fantasy. Visually and stylistically, you won't find two games in the series more similar to each other than Final Fantasy VII and VIII. The world, the characters, and the storytelling would fit the remake's engine like a glove. You'd think this would be a good thing, but I'm not so sure. Coming off of a completed Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's possible fans won't have much of an appetite for something that looks and feels so similar. This one's almost too close to call. Final Fantasy VI has the better story and the more compelling villain. Final Fantasy VIII is more cinematic and its character relationships are stronger. They're both great candidates, and in all honesty, I'd love to see either game remade in the style of Final Fantasy VII Remake. But since the object of the video is to pick what I feel is the best candidate to follow up that game, well, ultimately for me, the game I'm going with is the one that would be the harder remake to pull off. But if they got it right, the sky's the limit. Its foundation of story, world, character and theme is so strong. And at the same time, there's vast open spaces just waiting to be filled in with detail. For those reasons, the next game in the series I think should get a remake is Final Fantasy VI. With all that said, at the end of the day, as thrilled as I'd be to see some of my favorite games in the series get the remake treatment, I don't think it's the right move for Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy XII, XIII, and XV were still enjoyable games with their fair share of fans, but they were all more or less divisive, and the franchise hasn't had a slam dunk since probably Final Fantasy X. With the series on life support since the late 2000s, like a bunch of aging rock stars, Square's been feeding off of re-releases, remasters, and spin-offs. Square needed Final Fantasy VII Remake to recalibrate and remember what it's like to have a happy fanbase. Now that they're back on solid ground, it's time they poured all their love and attention into a completely new entry in the series. Give us Final Fantasy XVI already. It's been way too long, guys. Hey, speaking of remakes, I'm trying to remake my channel into something bigger and better, and you can help. If you like my content, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments below which Final Fantasy game you'd like to see remade. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.